"That's a working man's gun," the young man behind the counter said, turning the rifle over in his hands with the mild contempt of someone handling another person's laundry. "Nothing wrong with it. Just not something we'd normally see brought in for appraisal. You sure you didn't want to just sell it outright?" The old farmer standing at the counter didn't answer right away. He was watching the young man's hands, watching the way he held the rifle by the wooden stock like it was a piece of furniture, muzzle sweeping the crowded store without a thought, 3 customers in the blast radius and not a single one of them noticing. The farmer's name was Garrett Poe, and he had spent enough years of his life in rooms where inattention to a muzzle line cost people their teeth, their fingers, or considerably more permanent things. He let 2 seconds pass, then 3, the kind of silence that has weight to it. "I'd like an appraisal," he said. His voice was flat and dry as August pasture. He was somewhere in his late 60s, wearing a canvas work jacket that had been washed so many times the color had become its own thing. Not quite green, not quite brown, somewhere in the territory of long used. His boots were the same story. Good boots once, years ago, resoled at least twice and still going. His hands rested on the glass counter with a stillness that wasn't relaxed. It was the stillness of a man who had learned very specifically how to make his body do nothing. Behind him, the shop was crowded for a Tuesday afternoon. A gun shop in a mid-sized Georgia town, the kind of place that smells like hops number 9 and decades of slow Saturday mornings, cases of pistols and revolvers behind spotless glass, a rack of long guns along the back wall, 3 or 4 men browsing with the comfortable, unhurried pace of people who had nowhere to be and didn't apologize for it. Near the window, a man in his early 40s wearing a faded army hoodie was turning a box of .308 over in his hands without really reading it. His name was Dale Weston, and he had been a ranger long enough that the habit of reading rooms never fully left him. He had been aware of the old farmer since the man walked in. The young man behind the counter, Kyle, according to the name tag, 23 at most, set the rifle on the glass and pulled up something on his computer with practiced indifference. "This is an M40, right? Older configuration, Vietnam era?" "That's right. These aren't collector pieces the way people think," Kyle said with the generous authority of someone who had spent 8 months working behind a gun counter and confused that for expertise. He said it loud enough that the 2 men browsing nearby could hear, and one of them glanced over. "I mean, the wood's worn. The scope mount's been modified. There's a recrown on the barrel. Somebody used this thing hard. These go for a couple hundred on a good day. Maybe less, depending." He shrugged. "Sentimental value's usually worth more than the market." Garrett Poe looked at the rifle. He didn't look at Kyle. The rifle was a Remington 700, built to the M40 specifications that had been standard for Marine Corps snipers since the late 1960s. The stock was walnut, worn smooth from decades of contact with the same pair of hands. The scope was a Unertl 10 power, period correct, its glass still clean. The barrel had been re-crowned, yes, carefully, professionally, by someone who understood that accuracy lived in the last quarter inch of steel before the bullet left the world of physics it had been asked to obey. To someone who knew what they were looking at, this rifle was not a piece of worn-out history. It was a working instrument that had been maintained with devotion. But Kyle didn't know what he was looking at. He knew price guides and calibers and the difference between a Glock 17 and a Glock 19. He knew what his customers usually brought in. He didn't know this. "It belonged to my spotter," Garrett said. The words came out quiet and level, with no particular weight attached to them. Just information. "He passed last spring. His family asked me to see what it was worth." Kyle nodded with the sympathetic efficiency of a man trying to move a transaction forward. "Well, like I said, a couple hundred maybe. I can make you an offer if you want to sell today." Across the store, Dale Weston had gone very still. He was still holding the box of .308. He hadn't moved in 30 seconds. He was looking at the rifle on the counter, and then at the man who'd brought it in, and something in his face had changed in the way that faces change when the brain receives information it needs a moment to process. He set the ammunition down on the nearest shelf and straightened up. He was watching Garrett Poe the way a trained tracking dog watches a scent line, with focused, quiet attention. The worn jacket, The boots, the stillness, the way the old man had watched Kyle's muzzle discipline without saying a word about it, filing it away, deciding it wasn't his place to instruct. The economy of his movements, every gesture exactly as large as it needed to be. The way he'd said it belonged to my spotter with no more emotion than a man reading a parts list, not because he had no emotion, but because he had learned decades ago where and when emotion was permitted and was still honoring that discipline even now in a gun shop in Georgia. 60-something years old and wearing a jacket the color of something that had been through a great deal. Dale walked to the counter. He stood a few feet away and waited, because something in him, something trained, told him to wait, to observe before acting. "That's an M40A1 configuration," Dale said, not to Kyle, but neutrally, into the space of the store. Kyle glanced at him. "Right, that's what I said. Vietnam era." "Modified stock," Dale continued. "Unertl glass. Barrel works recent. Within the last 10-15 years, I'd say." He paused. "You don't do that kind of work on a rifle you're storing. You do it on a rifle you're still using." Garrett Poe turned and looked at Dale for the first time. It was a brief look, assessment and acknowledgement, the kind of glance exchanged between people who operate in the same professional language without needing to announce it. "Kept it accurate," Garrett said simply. "You shoot it still." "When I have reason to." The two men browsing had drifted closer, in the way that people drift toward a conversation whose frequency they can feel, even if they can't yet make out the words. One of them was ex-military in the way that certain men are, not from any single marker, but from an accumulation of small things. Posture, eye contact, the way he stood with his weight distributed like someone who has spent years on uncertain terrain. His name was Frank Oubre, late 50s, Navy, and he had been watching Garrett Poe from the moment the old man laid the rifle on the counter. Kyle was looking between the two men with the expression of someone who senses the conversation has moved into territory he doesn't have a map for. "It's still a used rifle," he said, with slightly less confidence. "The market for these—" "What unit?" Dale asked Garrett directly now. A pause, not hesitation, the pause of a man deciding how much of a room deserves an answer. "3rd Marines," Garrett said. "Second tour by choice, finished in SOG." The sound in the gun shop did not change. The ambient noise was the same. Country radio low from somewhere, the hum of the HVAC, a distant phone ringing in a back office. And yet something shifted, the way the atmosphere of a room can shift without any physical cause. Frank Oubre had gone completely still. Dale Weston's hand dropped from where he'd been gesturing toward the rifle, and he simply stood, recalibrating. SOG, Studies and Observations Group, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. The most classified special operations unit in American history during that conflict. Men who ran missions that didn't exist into places no one officially went, who were listed in personnel files under cover identities, whose operations were so far above classification that many of them remained sealed for decades. The kind of men whose service records were, even now, not entirely declassified. The kind of service that didn't show up on a discharge paper in any useful way. Kyle was watching a room that had changed around him and wasn't sure how. "You were a sniper," Dale said. It wasn't a question. "That was part of it," Garrett said. "What was your call sign?" The old farmer looked at him steadily. Something moved behind his eyes, not reluctance, but the assessment of whether this question deserved the full answer, whether the room warranted the truth, whether the truth served any purpose here beyond the one thing it had never been meant to serve, which was his own reputation. He had spent his whole life building a reputation he never talked about. He wasn't going to start performing it now. But there was something in Dale Weston's face, the genuine professional recognition of a man who had served and knew the weight of what he was asking. That settled the question. "Lazarus," Garrett Poe said. Frank Oubre exhaled through his nose, one quiet sound. Dale Weston took a half step back, and it was not a retreating step. It was the step of a man involuntarily making room for something larger than he expected. "Lazarus," he repeated very quietly. "Out of SOG." He looked at the rifle on the counter, then at the man standing behind it. "That name's in the training curriculum," he said. "For SOCOM. They use it as a case study." Kyle looked from one to the other. "I'm sorry. The rifle is worth considerably more than a couple $100, Dale said, turning to Kyle with the patient precision of someone correcting a navigational error before it became a grounding. "But that's not really the point." He looked back at Garrett. "Sir, I apologize for intruding. I was 75th Ranger. 2 tours Iraq. I should have introduced myself." "You recognized the rifle," Garrett said. "That was introduction enough." Frank Oob stepped forward and extended his hand. Frank Oob, Navy, 41st Rescue Squadron, later PJ instructor. His handshake was brief and firm. "Lazarus, I want you to know I've read the after-action summaries that were declassified. What your team did in 71, he stopped, shook his head. "The men who made it home because of that extraction." "Some made it home," Garrett said. "Not all of them." "No, but the ones who did." Frank paused. "I trained some of their sons." Something moved across Garrett Poe's face then. Something that lived below expression, a depth of feeling that the face didn't fully surface but didn't entirely hide either. He looked at Frank Oubre for a long moment. The old farmer with the worn jacket and the Risoled boots, standing in a gun shop on a Tuesday afternoon with his dead spotter's rifle on the glass counter, looking at a man who had trained the sons of men he'd pulled out of a place that didn't officially exist. "That's good to know," Garrett said finally. "That's good to hear." Kyle behind the counter had the look of a man who has realized mid-conversation that he is in the presence of a history he was not equipped to receive. He was quiet now, which was the correct choice. He was learning something about the gap between what a thing looks like and what it is, and he was learning it the way the lesson lands best, without anyone pointing at him, without anyone making an example, simply by standing in a room where the truth made itself evident. Dale Weston turned to the rifle on the counter. "If it's being sold, I can put you in contact with someone who would preserve it properly. A collection, there's a Veterans Museum in Fayetteville that handles pieces like this with the documentation intact. They'd want to know the provenance." "I'll mention it to the family," Garrett said. "They may want to keep it. I told them I'd find out what it was worth." "Tell them it's irreplaceable," Dale said. "Tell them the man who carried it was honored by the people who know what the name means." Garrett nodded once. He reached forward and picked up the rifle from the counter, correctly, muzzle down, hand on the action, and settled it under his arm. He looked at Kyle with no particular expression. "I appreciate your time," he said with complete sincerity, because Garrett Poe had been raised to thank people for their time, regardless of what they'd done with it. He walked toward the door. At the threshold, he paused and turned back, and for a moment the afternoon light came through the glass and fell across him, the worn jacket, the Risoled boots, the rifle under his arm, and there was nothing theatrical about it, no lingering for effect, just a man framed briefly by ordinary light. "Take care of your muzzle discipline," he said to Kyle quietly. "Every time, no matter where you are." Then he was through the door and gone, back to a truck in the parking lot, back to a farm somewhere, back to a life that had continued after the life that made him. Dale Weston stood at the counter for a moment looking at the door. Frank Oubre stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. Kyle was still behind the counter, and he was very still. And he was doing the thing that young men sometimes do when the world has handed them a glimpse of something far larger than their current understanding. He was sitting with it, not rushing to fill the silence, letting the weight of it settle into him like good soil after rain. He would think about that afternoon for a long time. He would think about a rifle he had called not worth much. He would think about the word Lazarus and look it up, and read what the declassified record said, and feel the particular sensation of having stood very close to something enormous without knowing it. Outside, in the parking lot, Garrett Poe laid his spotter's rifle carefully in the back seat of his truck and drove home through Georgia countryside going gold in the afternoon light. He did not think about what had happened inside the store. He thought about his spotter, a man named Denny Call, who had been from Beaumont, Texas, who had been afraid of spiders but not of anything else, who had spent 40 years after the war raising quarter horses and calling Garrett on his birthday without fail, who had died last March in the middle of a Wednesday with no drama and no warning. He thought about what it meant that Denny's rifle would go to people who understood what it was. And that was enough. That was more than enough. Some gifts return to you in forms you don't expect, not in fanfare, not in citation, but in a stranger's quiet exhale in a gun shop, in the news that the sons of men you once carried had been taught by someone who remembered, in the long reach of a life well spent, finding you in an ordinary afternoon and asking for nothing in return.